Lynette Hooker was reportedly on a dinghy with her husband when she went missing, but something doesn't add up. GPS data and electronic tracking show the boat wasn't where Brian Hooker said it was. Could this have been an accident, or is there more behind the story? Today, we're breaking down the latest update in the Lynette Hooker case, with details you need to know. On April 4th, 2026, Lynette Hooker, a 55-year-old woman from Michigan, disappeared while aboard a small dinghy in the waters near the Abaco Islands in the Bahamas. According to initial reports, Lynette was traveling with her husband, Brian Hooker, when she fell overboard. From the start, however, investigators noticed inconsistencies between Brian's account and the objective electronic data. GPS tracking from the boats, combined with cell tower data, revealed a story that did not match what Brian described. These discrepancies became the first clue that the situation might not have been an accident, despite the initially simple explanation of a woman lost at sea. The first critical point in this timeline was the disabling of the sailboat Soulmate's tracking system at 9:29 p.m. on the night of Lynette's disappearance. Experts in maritime navigation have noted that GPS systems do not simply switch off accidentally. These systems are designed to provide continuous positioning, even in adverse conditions. The act of turning off the device requires deliberate human action, and investigators immediately recognize this as a significant anomaly. It is a step no responsible boater would take, particularly in the open sea, where safety depends on accurate navigation and emergency tracking. The Coast Guard became involved in the investigation and designated it as a criminal matter rather than a routine accidental drowning. This decision reflects the growing concern over inconsistencies in Brian Hooker's statements and the digital evidence. At first, the case progressed slowly, with local authorities in the Bahamas coordinating with the Coast Guard's investigative services. The Margaret Norville, a high-tech Coast Guard cutter equipped with diverse search inflatables and advanced investigative tools, was deployed to thoroughly examine the waters and collect evidence from the scene. This vessel played a central role in uncovering the GPS discrepancies, tracking the actual routes taken by the boats, and documenting the locations in which Brian Hooker claimed Lynette entered the water. Caleb King, a correspondent providing updates from the Bahamas, highlighted the significance of the sailboat being seized and transported to Fort Lauderdale for processing. The sailboat itself became a key piece of evidence. Investigators began to analyze not just the GPS logs, but also the physical state of the vessel, onboard electronics, and any objects that might indicate where Lynette had been or where Brian may have moved the boat. Even small details, like the location of life vests, dry bags, and personal items, were critical to piecing together a timeline. Each detail of the boat's condition was cross-referenced against Brian Hooker's statements, revealing contradictions that further complicated his narrative. One of the most striking discrepancies involved the reported location of Lynette's disappearance versus the actual GPS coordinates. Brian claimed she fell overboard near a specific point along the dinghy's route, but the GPS data showed the boats had traveled along a different path entirely. Additionally, the timestamps from the electronic systems conflicted with Brian's account of how long he spent searching for his wife. These inconsistencies cast immediate doubt on the credibility of his statements and became the focal point for investigators as they began to consider whether Brian might have been intentionally misleading authorities. Experts consulted on the case emphasized the importance of consciousness of guilt, a legal concept that refers to actions suggesting someone is aware they have committed a crime. The disabling of the GPS system, in particular, is seen as an attempt to obscure movements and potentially conceal critical evidence. The Coast Guard's investigation thus focused not only on where Lynette may have fallen, but also on why the tracking system was intentionally deactivated. Analysts suggested that if Brian Hooker had committed a deliberate act against Lynette, the window when the GPS was off could indicate the period in which the most crucial events occurred. Brian Hooker's behavior in the hours and days following the disappearance further raised questions. While he initially presented himself as actively searching for his wife, subsequent actions, such as leaving the Bahamas shortly after promising to stay and aid in the search, were inconsistent with the claims of concern and urgency he projected. Combined with the GPS evidence, these actions were interpreted by some as indicative of potential wrongdoing. Investigators noted that even if Lynette had indeed entered the water at the location Brian reported, searches in that area had failed to yield any evidence supporting that version of events. This discrepancy further fueled the investigation, as authorities began to consider alternative scenarios in which Lynette's disappearance might have involved foul play. Another complicating factor in the timeline was Brian Hooker's series of statements to various authorities. Initially, he claimed to have searched extensively for Lynette, recounting hours spent in the water and efforts to find her with the dinghy. However, the GPS and electronic logs painted a different picture, showing his movements did not correspond to the described search patterns. Investigators also noted contradictions in his explanations about where he had been, which authorities interpreted as attempts to construct a narrative that could shield him from suspicion. The inconsistencies in timing, location, and actions became a core focus of the investigative timeline and are being carefully documented as part of the case file. In addition to the GPS evidence, investigators relied on electronic signals such as cell tower pings and navigation logs to verify the actual locations of the boats. Comparing these data points to Brian Hooker's statements allowed authorities to reconstruct a more accurate timeline of movements on the night of Lynette's disappearance. The mapping of these routes revealed gaps and inconsistencies that are unlikely to have occurred if his story were completely truthful. Every deviation from the claimed timeline became a data point suggesting deliberate misrepresentation, prompting closer scrutiny from both the Coast Guard and federal authorities. Maritime experts emphasize that the sea is an environment where technology is critical for safety and accountability. Turning off GPS or disabling electronic tracking can obscure movements in ways that may prevent rescuers from locating someone in distress. In this case, the intentional disabling of the sailboat's GPS not only raised questions about Brian Hooker's intentions, but also complicated the search efforts. The Coast Guard's investigative teams focused on both the physical evidence aboard the vessel and the digital footprints left behind, building a timeline that relies on verifiable data rather than anecdotal accounts. At the heart of this segment of the investigation is the contrast between Brian Hooker's narrative and objective evidence. While he described a scenario in which Lynette accidentally fell overboard and he spent hours attempting to rescue her, the GPS data, sailboat location, and timing inconsistencies suggest a different reality. Investigators are treating these discrepancies seriously, as they may indicate intentional manipulation of events. This analysis of electronic evidence and timeline reconstruction forms the foundation of the first phase of the investigation, as authorities seek to determine whether criminal intent can be established based on available facts. The investigation also considers the context of Brian Hooker's prior behavior, including domestic history and interpersonal interactions, which may inform potential patterns relevant to the case. By placing the timeline discrepancies within the broader context of his life and previous conduct, investigators aim to build a comprehensive understanding of his credibility. This includes not only GPS and electronic evidence, but also behavioral analysis, which together contribute to forming a potential circumstantial case. Finally, experts note that while the GPS data and timeline discrepancies are compelling, they are only part of a larger mosaic of evidence that investigators will continue to evaluate. Recovery efforts, analysis of the sailboat, and corroborating accounts all feed into the ongoing reconstruction of events. The first part of the investigation, therefore, is dedicated to establishing where the boats were when the GPS system was disabled and how these facts compare to Brian Hooker's public and private statements. This meticulous approach lays the groundwork for subsequent phases of the investigation and sets the stage for potential legal proceedings. Following the initial phase of the investigation, authorities focused on the physical and digital evidence aboard the sailboat Soulmate itself. The vessel was seized and transported to a Coast Guard facility in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where investigators began a comprehensive analysis. This step marked a critical turn in the investigation, shifting from examining location discrepancies to scrutinizing tangible evidence and Brian Hooker's behavior. Experts in maritime crime emphasize that boats, particularly in open water, are essentially self-contained crime scenes. Everything on board, from navigation systems to personal effects, can reveal the truth about what transpired. One of the first elements examined was the sailboat's onboard GPS and navigation system. Investigators discovered that the device had been disabled at a critical moment on the night of Lynette Hooker's disappearance. Unlike a power outage or accidental malfunction, the system's shutdown appeared intentional, suggesting a deliberate act to obscure the boat's movements. This action raised immediate concerns among authorities, who now considered not just the location of the vessel, but the implications of altering the boat's electronic record. Disabling the GPS effectively created a period of unrecorded activity, hours in which Brian Hooker's exact movements could not be tracked, introducing the possibility that key events, potentially including the disposal of evidence, occurred during this window. In addition to the GPS system, the sailboat contained several other pieces of evidence that investigators were analyzing carefully. Items such as Lynette's personal effects, including a watch, bags, and clothing, were examined for location and condition. Dive teams were deployed to search surrounding waters, both near the reported accident site and other areas highlighted by GPS analysis, while investigators documented which items were recovered and which were missing. The physical positioning of these objects provided investigators with a timeline of movement, showing which areas had been accessed or disturbed and suggesting possible locations where crucial evidence might have been moved or concealed. Authorities also focused on the boat's electronic devices beyond navigation. Onboard recording equipment, potentially capturing audio or video during the time of Lynette's disappearance, became a subject of careful review. Even if direct recordings were not available, metadata from these devices, such as last active timestamps or power cycles, could indicate when and where the vessel was in use. These details were cross-referenced against Brian Hooker's statements to assess their credibility. Every mismatch between recorded activity and his account represented a potential point of circumstantial evidence. Investigators were particularly attentive to the inconsistencies between the GPS route and Brian Hooker's claimed actions. For example, while he asserted that he spent hours attempting to rescue Lynette near a specific point in the Bahamian waters, the GPS data and cell tower logs suggested he was elsewhere during key time frames. Experts explained that these inconsistencies are not merely minor errors, they can signal intentional misdirection, raising questions about the credibility of his narrative. By comparing the physical evidence aboard the sailboat with digital traces, investigators sought to build a coherent reconstruction of events, highlighting where actions deviated from what Brian reported. The handling of the sailboat itself offered additional insights. The vessel was placed in dry dock and sealed at the Coast Guard facility, ensuring that evidence would be preserved for forensic analysis. Investigators meticulously examined surfaces for fingerprints, DNA traces, and other forensic markers. Even seemingly mundane elements, such as water stains or signs of cleaning, could provide clues about attempts to conceal evidence. Maritime experts emphasize that boats are unique environments where every object, movement, and placement is potentially significant, and investigators are trained to interpret even subtle anomalies. Brian Hooker's actions following Lynette's disappearance were also under scrutiny as part of the investigation into suspicious behavior. Reports indicated that he returned to the United States and sought the services of a former U.S. attorney, reflecting his awareness of the seriousness of federal involvement. This move indicated to investigators that he recognized potential exposure to criminal charges and was preparing for complex legal proceedings. Combined with prior inconsistencies and the disabling of the GPS, this behavior contributed to the growing perception of potential culpability. Investigators also considered the broader context of Brian Hooker's life and interpersonal history as they evaluated the evidence. Accounts of domestic disputes, prior threats, or patterns of behavior were examined to assess whether past actions might be indicative of potential criminal conduct. While these background factors are not conclusive on their own, when combined with physical and digital evidence, they provide a more comprehensive understanding of his actions and credibility. This contextual analysis is especially relevant when constructing a circumstantial case, where the totality of evidence must support logical inferences about what may have occurred. Dive operations became another critical element of evidence collection. Coast Guard divers searched areas surrounding the reported site of Lynette's disappearance, as well as alternative locations suggested by GPS and other electronic data. They documented the condition of the water, sediment, and submerged objects to understand where items might have settled or been moved by currents. The search focused not only on Lynette herself, but also on potential evidence she may have carried, such as personal belongings or devices. Each recovery, or lack thereof, helped investigators refine the likely sequence of events and evaluate the plausibility of Brian Hooker's narrative. Another layer of investigation involved cross-referencing statements from multiple sources. Witness reports, including communications with local authorities and emails from individuals on the ground in the Bahamas, were compared against GPS data and onboard findings. Every discrepancy, no matter how small, added to the complexity of the investigation. Forensic analysts explained that inconsistencies in timing, location, or object placement are key markers when determining whether events occurred as described or if deliberate obfuscation took place. Finally, the case highlights the intersection of physical evidence, digital records, and human behavior. Investigators are not only looking at where the boat was or what objects are present, they are analyzing decisions made under stress and opportunity. The intentional disabling of GPS, the discrepancies in reported locations, and Brian Hooker's rapid departure from the search area all form a pattern of behavior that investigators are examining closely. This holistic approach allows law enforcement to construct a timeline and chain of events with a high degree of precision, even if direct eyewitness evidence is limited. By combining these multiple streams of evidence, GPS tracking, physical artifacts, dive recovery data, and behavioral analysis, investigators are building a comprehensive picture of the night Lynette Hooker disappeared. This process, while meticulous and time-intensive, ensures that any potential legal action is supported by strong, verifiable evidence. Every inconsistency documented on the sailboat and in digital systems strengthens the investigatory framework, providing law enforcement with the tools needed to determine what truly happened during those critical hours at sea. As the investigation into Lynette Hooker's disappearance progressed, attention shifted toward the legal framework surrounding the case. Unlike a straightforward missing person scenario, this matter involves multiple jurisdictions, complex federal maritime law, and the coordination between U.S. and Bahamian authorities. The sailboat involved, the Soulmate, is U.S. flagged, which means that the United States retains significant legal jurisdiction over incidents that occur on board. This distinction is critical because it allows federal prosecutors to oversee proceedings and coordinate with the Coast Guard, ensuring that evidence collected abroad can be admissible in U.S. courts. Brian Hooker, though currently in Michigan, is under the scrutiny of federal authorities. Reports indicate that he has engaged multiple attorneys, including a former U.S. attorney, to prepare for potential legal proceedings. This strategic move is interpreted as an acknowledgement of the seriousness of the investigation, particularly in light of the coordinated efforts by the Coast Guard and the Department of Justice. Legal experts have emphasized that his decision to retain high-level legal counsel signals awareness of both the evidence collected and the gravity of potential charges. One of the primary objectives of the investigation is to build a comprehensive record that can withstand judicial scrutiny. This includes not only the physical and digital evidence aboard the sailboat, but also documentation of Brian Hooker's statements, timelines, and actions before and after Lynette Hooker's disappearance. Prosecutors aim to establish a chain of custody for all recovered materials, from GPS data to personal effects and dive-recovered items. Maintaining this chain is essential to ensure that evidence is credible and cannot be easily challenged in court. Investigators are also meticulously analyzing the consistency of Brian Hooker's narratives over time. This involves comparing statements made to local Bahamian authorities, media interviews, and communications with federal agencies. Each contradiction is cataloged and contextualized, not merely as a discrepancy, but as potential evidence that could demonstrate awareness of wrongdoing or an intent to mislead. Legal analysts note that these inconsistencies, when properly presented, can form part of a circumstantial case, which in federal court can be sufficient to secure charges even in the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. The process of preparing a federal case is methodical and deliberate. Authorities have indicated that even if Lynette Hooker's remains are not recovered, a combination of physical, electronic, and behavioral evidence could establish probable cause for prosecution. This includes detailed records of GPS activity, the deliberate deactivation of navigation systems, inconsistencies in search actions, and prior patterns of conduct that may be relevant to assessing intent. The strategic approach ensures that, when charges are filed, the case will present a clear and cohesive narrative that jurors can follow, reducing opportunities for defense strategies to exploit gaps or ambiguities. Part of the legal planning involves evaluating jurisdictional issues. While the Bahamas maintains primary jurisdiction over crimes occurring in its territorial waters, the United States has the authority to prosecute crimes on U.S.-flagged vessels, particularly when U.S. citizens are involved. In this scenario, the Coast Guard, acting under federal oversight, collaborates closely with the Department of Justice to determine the most appropriate forum for prosecution. Legal experts have emphasized that this coordination is essential to avoid procedural complications that could arise from overlapping jurisdictions or questions about the admissibility of foreign collected evidence. Brian Hooker's prior consultations with attorneys also suggest preparation for complex legal arguments that may arise in federal court. The selection of a former U.S. attorney as counsel indicates a focus on anticipating federal procedural standards, potential motions to suppress evidence, and strategies to address circumstantial evidence in a manner favorable to the defense. This type of high-level legal planning underscores the seriousness with which both the defense and prosecution are approaching the case. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard's investigative team continues to play a pivotal role in building the evidentiary foundation. Diverse, forensic specialists and analysts are reviewing every recovered object, from dry bags to navigation panels, ensuring that each item is properly cataloged and analyzed for forensic value. DNA testing, fingerprint analysis, and electronic device recovery are all part of the investigative process. By maintaining meticulous records, investigators ensure that the evidence is admissible in federal court and can withstand challenges from defense attorneys attempting to discredit findings. A significant aspect of the ongoing legal proceedings involves public and media communications. Authorities are navigating the delicate balance of transparency and discretion, releasing certain updates to maintain public trust while protecting the integrity of the investigation. Legal experts emphasize that premature disclosure of evidence could compromise potential prosecutions, influence witness testimony, or provide the defense with tactical advantages. As such, the release of information is carefully staged to support procedural and evidentiary objectives. The procedural next steps are equally methodical. If charges are filed, the case will likely proceed in federal court in Miami, given the federal jurisdiction over U.S.-flagged vessels and the involvement of U.S. citizens. Pretrial activities will include discovery, where both prosecution and defense exchange evidence, motions to suppress or exclude evidence, and potential challenges regarding jurisdiction or admissibility of foreign collected data. The thorough preparation at this stage is intended to ensure that when the case reaches trial, it is fully supported by verifiable evidence and credible witness accounts. Additionally, legal analysts have noted the importance of building a case that can withstand scrutiny even without a recovered body. In certain federal cases, circumstantial evidence, when properly corroborated, has been sufficient to establish intent and support criminal charges. The GPS logs, deactivation of electronic tracking, inconsistencies in timelines, and detailed analysis of physical evidence collectively form a robust circumstantial framework. This framework allows federal prosecutors to demonstrate patterns of behavior, decision-making, and intent in a manner that is compelling to a jury. Authorities are also preparing for potential defense strategies. By anticipating the defense's arguments, including claims of accidental drowning or misinterpretation of GPS data, prosecutors can preemptively structure the case to address these claims. This includes documenting environmental conditions, verifying the functioning of electronic systems, and ensuring that expert witnesses are available to explain complex technical evidence in clear terms for the court. Finally, the investigation underscores the complexity of maritime cases involving multiple jurisdictions, advanced technology, and the intersection of behavioral and forensic evidence. Each element, from GPS deactivation to physical evidence recovery and timeline analysis, contributes to a comprehensive understanding of the events surrounding Lynette Hooker's disappearance. The legal trajectory, while still developing, demonstrates a deliberate and calculated approach to ensuring that any potential prosecution is fully supported, whether or not her remains are recovered. The combination of federal oversight, Coast Guard expertise, and meticulous evidence management positions the case for a rigorous judicial process, with all parties aware that accuracy, precision, and procedural integrity are paramount. As this investigation continues, authorities and the public alike await further developments. The legal next steps, including the potential filing of charges, pretrial motions, and eventual trial proceedings, will be closely tied to the evidence collected and analyzed in this phase. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard and federal agencies remain committed to ensuring that all procedural standards are met and that the case, if it proceeds to trial, reflects the full scope of available evidence. Thank you for watching and following along with the latest updates in the Lynette Hooker case. As the investigation unfolds, authorities continue to analyze every piece of evidence, every GPS log, and every statement, working meticulously to uncover the truth. While many questions remain, one thing is clear. This case is far from ordinary, and the timeline and actions of those involved will continue to be scrutinized closely. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the discrepancies in the GPS and electronic records point to an accident, or is there more beneath the surface? Share your perspective in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and it helps us understand how viewers are interpreting the facts. If you want to stay updated as new details emerge, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future updates. We'll continue to follow this case closely and bring you all verified developments. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next video.